You're listening to Lucid Cafe. Hey, I'm Wendy Halley. Thanks for joining me for another episode of Lucid Cafe, a podcast exploring healing, consciousness, and the complexities of being human. Before we get to today's guest, are you ready to unleash your inner shaman? The Magical Path is an experiential workbook that walks you through the basics of shamanic dreaming with exercises designed to help you explore your inner worlds and connect with personal helping spirits. With 2 audio tracks to help safely guide you into a conscious dreaming state, you'll be able to unlock the magic waiting inside of you. The Magical Path Workbook is available on Amazon and at the shop on my website, lucidpathwellness.com. Links can be found in the show notes. All right, let's get to it. Very happy to report that Mitch Horowitz is back on the show. However, I'm unhappy to report holy echo. The tech gods were not happy the day we recorded, at least not with me. A big thanks to Mitch, who was very patient as I wrestled with the distracting echo and did my best to have a conversation with him. Fortunately, the issue didn't affect Mitch's audio at all, but it definitely affected mine. I did what I could to clean it up, but it's still not great. I'm sorry for that. We cover a lot of ground in our conversation, most of it inspired by his latest book, Uncertain Places, which is a broad collection of essays on occult and outsider experiences. If you're not familiar with Mitch, he's a historian of alternative spirituality and one of today's most literate voices of esoterica, mysticism, and the occult. Through his many lectures, books, and articles, he shines a light on outsider history so that we can understand its relevance to contemporary life. And as you'll discover when diving into his writings or listening to him speak, Mitch not only brings attention to fringe spiritual practices and beliefs, but he has also applied the principles he's uncovered to his own life, and then shares with us what he's learned along the way, which is very cool in my book. So please enjoy my conversation with Mitch Horowitz. Mitch, thanks for coming on.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Yeah, so you have, well, your most recent book is a collection of essays called Uncertain Places. And when I was reading it, I was thinking it's kind of like a survey course, like Mitch 101. It covers this broad spectrum of your work over the years and your explorations and your experimentations. It's a really cool introduction to you, I think. Is that what you were kind of intending?
Well, not so much as an introduction as an encapsulation of questions I've been asking, corners I've been searching in for the past 20 years or so, and also a book that captures the uncertainty, the fluidity of my own search, I presume of the search and experience of other people. So much seems in flux in our culture, not a statement I would make lightly, but with the mainstreaming of the UFO thesis and various questions about the perceptual nature of reality and what social forms we're going to take in a post-COVID world, it seems to me we're all living in uncertain places to some degree.
One of the things I was thinking about when I was reading your book, this idea of possibility, like tapping into human possibility and potential. And I found myself starting to daydream while I was reading your book about, like, man, what are we actually capable of doing, right? And I was also thinking about, I don't know if you watched Graham Hancock's Ancient Apocalypse series on Netflix.
I haven't seen it, no.
No, I don't know if you're familiar with his work or the stuff he's been looking into, but the idea that there are ancient civilizations that have maybe contributed to helping us along. The idea that maybe these ancient civilizations had figured out some technology of consciousness that helped us move forward and planted some seeds of possibility.
Well, it's a large neighborhood we live in. You know, I haven't seen the show. I am very moved to realize that our most ancient primeval ancestors did have extraordinary intellectual lives. They had religious systems. I mean, this literally goes back to the Neanderthals, not as a figure of speech, but actually. Our most primeval ancestors used talismans, for example. They created vast numbers of little figurines that we refer to as Venus figurines. They were fertility statues shaped in a kind of rounded female form. They used bear claws, eagle talons as talismans to receive personal power, to relate to something greater. Even during the Bronze Age, humanity constructed altars worshiping the moon, all these periods of time that precede written language with any commonality do contain vestiges of a mythology, a religious system. I'm getting more and more interested in primeval religion because it so strips, I mean, obviously it's come down to us in just the most fragmentary forms in terms of remaining artifacts and so on, but, and paintings as well. But it's just extraordinary to peer into a religious system that pre-existed any liturgy or known formality. And it's quite a treasure to us that we have any window at all on what our primeval ancestors were thinking about, and they were thinking. They were complex beings.
Yeah, pretty complex. I mean, it's a much different way of looking at our history than I think we have been looking at. I think the word primitive gets used a lot, and that's unfortunate. Yeah, but the idea that what could we be capable of? I mean, you think about aliens, right? The possibility that there are civilizations way out there somewhere. Like, imagine a civilization that has existed for 1 billion years. What could they possibly be capable of?
I don't know if we could relate to them. It's difficult for us even to relate to other cultures. You know, in Mayan civilization, it's thought to be that being cross-eyed was considered to be a physically attractive trait, and beads would be hanged from an individual's forehead to induce the effect of being cross-eyed. It's difficult for us as modern Westerners to relate to that. So it's so hard for us to get out of our own skin and fathom how we would even understand or be understood by a civilization that's vastly removed from our own. We see that even within human cultures that existed not very long ago. And I think with respect to the ET thesis or the UFO thesis, one also encounters the extra-dimensional thesis and the question of whether everything is going on all at once, apropos of string theory, and that sometimes we're just having encounters with or getting information about other intelligences that are here right now, that are coexistent in this eternal now that we live in. So what are their attitudes, outlooks? It's almost an infinite question.
Right. And if that is happening, then they clearly have figured some shit out that we haven't figured out. The idea that if we are being contacted by some very advanced civilization, it's like if you just start trying to wrap your head around it, it just demonstrates how much we have to learn.
And we've undergone a remarkable change in our own immediate era with the mainstreaming of the UFO thesis. I think that with the release of the Pentagon videos, the New York Times coverage in 2017, among other things, UFOs have entered the national conversation in a way that I wouldn't have fathomed 10 years ago. And this subject can be and is discussed in any variety of mainstream places. People feel disinhibited about speaking of it on the job, anywhere they dwell, whereas there was a greater degree of shyness years earlier. Someone was telling me that several years ago when Congressman Dennis Kucinich was running for president and said from the debate stage that he had witnessed a UFO, his support went from 26% to 3% in polls. I think the equation would be flip-flop today, actually. There has been a real cultural change, and what comes out of that is going to be very exciting to see. We're part of it.
Yeah.
It's going on at this instant.
Absolutely. Have you ever seen one?
No.
Me either. So getting back to this idea of possibility, I think one of the things that I really enjoy about your work is how you are encouraging people to stretch themselves, to not just read about this stuff, but to actually put it into practice, planting the seed of possibility so we could strive towards something. Otherwise, we're just going to keep sort of spinning in the same place. And the idea that thought can be this sort of springboard.
Well, I want people, I mean, if there's one thing I want more than anything for the reader, it is to feel a sense of liberty in his or her own personal search and to take nothing off the table in that regard. So much of the way that we frame ourselves and frame our thoughts is conditioned by ideas that have been handed down to us and repeated with such frequency, including the imperative to think in opposites, including the notion that we live in a kind of hierarchical cosmic order, including questions of how one is supposed to be on the spiritual path, questions of attachment versus non-attachment, and so on. And these are all just concepts and words and qualities that have gotten inured in us by dint of repetition, by dint of overwhelming familiarity. And I always say to people, familiarity is not truth. And if the search is to deserve such a name, then the individual within the privacy of his or her own psyche and the intimacy of his or her own being is at liberty to do or try anything. There may be consequences, of course, so I encourage people to approach things maturely, but also approach them bravely. So much orthodoxy gets baked into our different subcultures, including the alternative spiritual subculture of which I'm a part, the notion of enlightenment or realization or awakeness or clarity or awareness and the things that are supposed to be hallmarks of that. I really want to open up to question. The wish is for the individual to lead a life in which he or she feels a sense of power, a sense of personal agency, a sense of being at home in your own skin. And I don't want any kind of orthodoxy, including those that we create for ourselves on the alternative spiritual scene, to detract from that. So I want people to feel tremendously at liberty. And it starts with a great deal of frankness to oneself, asking yourself what you want and not deferring to the shop-worn ideas, phrases, framings that too quickly come, which are very often marked by internal peer pressure. If a person were to ask himself the question of what he or she wants in a completely fresh and intimate and unembarrassed way, the answer will almost always be surprising.
You say this with a lot of confidence, right? And to me, that speaks to your own experience. What was the most challenging thing you had to face in order to be able to speak with this level of confidence?
Well, I do speak from personal experience, as you were alluding, and my assumption is that no life is exceptional. I assume that if I'm going through something, I'm not the only person going through it, and that others will hear this and say, yeah, I recognize that in my own life. Others may not relate to it or may have their own objections, but none of us, it would seem to me, are exceptional. So a profoundly important experience that a person has, or efforts, let's say, that a person wants to share, are almost certainly likely to touch the needs of another person. As far as speaking confidently, I remember, I think I was in 7th grade, and I delivered an oral book report to my teacher, Miss Wilimowski, and it was about the Native American athlete Jim Thorpe, a really great figure who led a profoundly challenging life. And she said to me, my God, you're so articulate. I'd never thought of myself that way before. So here's to the middle school teachers. Hearing those words, and I've remembered her name ever since, were meaningful to me because I'd never identified myself that way. And I suppose it opened up a door.
All right. So getting feedback, in this example from a teacher, reflecting you back to yourself, would you say that's the same case in your experimentation?
Oh, yes, without question. I'm 57, and I'm much happier today than I was when I was age 17, for example. I feel a vaster degree of freedom, I've met friends growing older who were sometimes depressed over it, and look, we're all going to check out at some point or another.
That's what they're saying, yeah.
Yeah. I have had the experience over the past couple of weeks where I noticed I was recognizing more and more names in the obituary section. And I thought, well, there goes another. And then I realized, well, actually, there is there is a calendar-driven dimension to this. At the same time, I tell friends, who are getting older and have questions sometimes about that. Look, it may be evoking of anxiety, but I can tell you for an absolute fact, I'm a great deal happier today than I was 10 years ago, 20 years ago. So hence, I want to share these ideas. They're hard won. There's a lot of sweat equity in them. There's failure in them. But again, I assume that useful to one, useful to another.
Yeah, and that's what I wanted to kind of get your feedback on, because I think there's a lot of folks who really would like to believe that these ideas you write about and others have written about are possible, but they might try it and then bump up against some sort of obstacle or feel like they fail at it. And I'm curious about the failure part. Like, what is it that gets in our own way?
Yeah, I think that certain forms and ways of proceeding can get in our way. Things that work for one person may or may not, in fact, work for another. And we have different temperaments, characters, proclivities, emotional issues. One of the things I've been experimenting with lately is the question of whether, if the mind has a causative element, if there's a perceptual basis to reality, and I firmly believe that there is, what is the turnkey to enabling that? Very often within New Thought literature, and I'm very dedicated to New Thought, and I love New Thought, the philosophy of mind causation, we'll say. Very often the method is to assume the feeling state or assume the emotional state of the wish fulfilled, and that will serve as the royal road to unlocking the agencies of the psyche. And to some degree that's scripturally based. Christ taught one should pray with faith of having already received, and you shall receive. So that's been more or less the formula that's been at work in New Thought for the past 125, 150 years. But I said to myself at a certain point, that doesn't really meet the individual where he or she lives. If a person is suffering from grief or anxiety or fear, sometimes very justified, cultivating an emotional state is not always possible. In fact, frequently it's not possible at all. The emotions are stronger than thought, or we wouldn't have problems with addictions, or we wouldn't have problems with emotional outbursts. We can resolve to do things. I won't get angry at my neighbor Mike, but then Mike parks on my lawn again, and my emotions are off and running. So it's a very tough conundrum for the individual, especially when he or she is told that the assumption of the feeling state is the royal road to unlocking the causative abilities of the psyche. So I've asked myself, and I've written about this in my book Daydream Believer, whether the clearly defined and passionately held wish in itself might be sufficient to enact these agencies. Otherwise, it would seem as though Mother Nature has played a kind of a cruel joke on us. If you're in a state of fear, you can get out of it by cultivating a state of courage. Well, those are just words. The emotions are a mighty horse, and they're often running, and no matter how I try to jigger the reins, it might not obey me. But what if another method, not discounting emotional cultivation, but what if another method could be the focused wish in and of itself, passionately felt, well-defined, uncompromisingly honest and real? What if that could be? And that's why I'm always encouraging people to be unembarrassed with themselves about what they really want. Because sometimes an individual will think something, hold it within his or her psyche, and then maybe speak it out loud or speak it to a friend or something. And they'll think, oh, God, I sound so superficial. I sound so shallow. But again, I think one has to be really careful about where that comes from. Maybe it's internalized peer pressure. Maybe it's cultural peer pressure. Maybe it's decisions that have been made by somebody else in ancient literature that we've imbibed through translations of translations to tell us what is and isn't a good path. I think that the individual needs to start with that stark self-honesty, even if it's uncomfortable. Because the great likelihood is we're going to go in the direction blindly or with clear perspective of what we really want. And to not know it is a great tragedy.
And then I wonder about let's say you want to select for money. That's a real bare bones desire that most of us have. And you are wishing like hell for this money to come into your life. But in your psyche is embedded this old belief, maybe it's like an ancestral belief, that there's not enough, something contrary to your wish. Do you think that has any play in whether or not you can bring said money to you?
Well, it can be derailing, certainly, and it can lead to self-destructive or self-deceptive actions. I've always had difficulty defining the word faith. What does faith mean? How do you cultivate it? I tend to substitute the word persistence for faith. I think there is a comity between those two concepts. And persistence, it seems to me, is a kind of faith. It's certainly the closest thing I can arrive at as a definition of faith. And I think that persistence in the direction of a really exquisitely well-defined aim, something that you want, maybe you don't get to choose the color of the curtains and the carpet and so forth and so on, but if you know that there's something that you really wish for and you're deeply persistent in that direction, barring some overwhelming countervailing measure, and those do exist. We live in a dynamic neighborhood, and there's many laws and forces that we have to experience, including mortality itself. But I do believe that there is something, I'm going to say lawful about getting there, getting to that place. Although a law, while it must be consistent, is also conditioned by other things going on in the surroundings. Water is always H2O, but it could be a solid, a vapor, a liquid, depending on surrounding conditions. So I'm not down with this idea that we live under one mental super law that's the only game in town. That may be true in some ultimate sense. It may be true that consciousness or awareness or perception is an ultimate arbiter of reality. But the circumstances in which we dwell are very dynamic and messy. And I think a natural law is conditioned all the time. It's present like a law of gravity, but one experiences gravity different on Earth than on the moon or on Jupiter. So there's going to be surrounding conditions, but this is where the individual experiments. What works, when, under what circumstances? And if something doesn't work, does that mean you give up? Does that mean you try again? You value these experiences. You value the frictions. They do get you somewhere. I've never experienced a wounding that didn't somehow make me stronger. There may come a day and a time and a place where that wounding proves too great. But at this time and place, it hasn't. And I think that a great deal of persistence is required.
I like the word persistence too. And it makes me think that you could sort of carve your way through until you get to the outcome. You just hang in there. Ultimately, aren't we trying to get towards trust too? I think you can't just trust or right out the gate. There's some steps that you have to take in order to get to trust. And I think direct experience is a big part of that. But in order to get there, you have to be persistent.
And passion helps with that as well, which is why self-honesty is so important. People often ask how it is that I'm so productive and turning out one book after another, hopefully, of quality. And I do have a tremendous passion for it. It's a dream that was unfulfilled until I reached my early 40s. I didn't publish my first book, Occult America, until I was age 43, going on 44. And I always like to remind people of that, not only in terms of their own experience and possibilities, but I never take a day for granted. I never take a day for granted. When I was in my 30s, I thought I had left writing behind me. I was really trying to accommodate myself to being a publishing executive, and it was a fitful existence. Publishing gave me a lot of good things, but I wasn't really doing what I wanted to do. And being able to put out my work at a steady pace is a thrill. It's a thrill that never, never leaves me. And that passion is incredibly driving. I realized when I was working on my first book, I wanted to finish it and do a good job on it more than I wanted to sleep. Now, that can't be a permanent bargain. Eventually, the body is going to win. But you can go periods of time that way. Medical residents certainly do. Lots of people do. And what is physically possible to us, what is mentally possible to us, what is emotionally possible to us, are boundaries that we very rarely push. We very rarely push them. We like creature comforts. We like falling asleep, eating potato chips and, with the news on or the game on or whatever, and smoking weed or drinking beer. And there's a place for all that stuff. But one has to be really careful because that stuff can also be an off-ramp from pursuing some sense of self-expression, whatever it is. It can be any number of things. But if an individual gives him or herself over to that, it can create a real despair. It can create a real ennui. And then it's hard to get out of that. We start to accept the framing that we've been given. But pushing at those boundaries can be the most joyous experience of a person's life, I think. It has been for me.
Yeah, with the understanding that you're probably going to fuck up along the way and that shouldn't be an invitation to stop.
Yeah. I couldn't frame it better. I agree with that entirely. We're going to make mistakes, and unless we're very exceptional people, we're going to make the same mistakes again. I remember there was an episode of Breaking Bad where the character Gus said to Walter, Gus was this drug lord, but a very refined, very impressive man. And he said, "Oh, I made lots of mistakes, but never the same one twice." And I thought, how I wish I could be like Gus, never make the same one twice. I have made the same mistake over and over. But there was a refinement that emerged, and it had to do with persistence and passion.
All right. So this might be a good time to transition into thy will be done versus my will be done. And what you're doing kind of in the mainstream, or at least trying to bring a true definition of Satanism to the mainstream.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. I came to feel in 2017 that my own search was getting stale. And I came to feel that a lot of my search was very heavily conditioned by the Abrahamic religious culture, which has swept our Western world, Christianity, Judaism, Islam. And I wasn't, frankly, much more satisfied with the Vedic or Buddhist cultures. I felt like these traditions have within them universal ideas, some of which are extraordinary, some of which are local and which were in response culturally to local circumstances. Every religion is crafted by human hands. There's no exception to that. And I came to feel a certain hypocrisy, not only in my search, but I thought, based on years and years of personal experience, that it was general to many precincts of the spiritual culture, which is that we like to perfume our searches, and we like to say, I'm pursuing truth, I'm pursuing understanding, I'm pursuing non-attachment, or pursuing something called enlightenment, which is a word I have a very great allergy to because I think it's partly a fiction. And when we pray, as we're often taught in the Abrahamic tradition, thy will be done, we're saying those words, but there's often a covert wish behind them. I'm hoping that my will comports with whatever the will of the higher power is, and I'll make every effort to bow my head in deference if it doesn't, but I'm going to go back and try again. And I came to feel that that was unsatisfying, that was concealing of something. And very often on the path, I've experienced this personally, and I've witnessed it in the lives of some of my close friends and colleagues and those who I collaborate with. There's a tendency to strive, to desire, to reach, to wish. And then there's this coexistent tendency to pursue something called non-identification, non-attachment, essence above personality, the unseen above the seen, understanding above all. And these things kind of tear us in two. They tear us in two because we very frequently are using spiritual methods in the direction of some personal expression while at the same time being conditioned or conditioning ourselves to deny rather than embrace that personal expression. And I believe very strongly that the critical turnkey to a satisfying life is a sense of personal power, personal agency, self-expression, broadly defined. And I don't think the individual needs to condition, apologize, translate that. I believe the mature individual is capable of knowing what he or she wants. That's not to say that I or anyone else is liberated from debt, from ethics, from relationships, which are the foundation that we stand on. And I take that too very, very seriously. There's going to be debt for anything. And that is a fire stick that somebody should be really careful about and really thoughtful about. But I think that the sense of quiet ennui, desperation, low-grade depression, low-grade anxiety that follows people throughout life, often follows them across the arc of their search, results from an unwillingness to acknowledge what one is after. And from my personal perspective, at this point in my search, I came to be more comfortable with the question of seeking a relationship to greater forces in the name of coming into power, greater personal power. And I realize some people hear that and it sounds corrupt, but we have to get down to the specifics of what's really being said. I don't mean force. I don't mean violence. I don't mean some libertine lifestyle where the hell with everybody else, I'll just do whatever I want. I'd be burning the bridge underneath my own feet. I don't have that many personal relationships, but I have a partner, I have kids, I have people with whom I have business relationships. Those are owed something. They're owed a great deal. So I don't take a go-it-alone approach to life. But when I use a word like power, I use it not to be provocative, but to be frank about what it is that I'm after. And I invite another person, if they feel like it, to consider that question and not to recoil and say, that sounds like a bad term. That sounds like Darth Vader in one of the early Star Wars movies. Well, Darth Vader's a lot more complicated character than we think, as we learned.
Indeed, yeah.
And I think that the individual, first and foremost, needs to get in touch with what he or she is really after. For me, it lay in the direction of my will be done, not thy will be done.
All right. And so that was inspired by your explorations of Satanism?
I would say Satanism probably grew as an adjunct to that. I was fascinated with the figure of, or with figures that became associated with the satanic in Scripture and in other parables of the human story. And I made a very different reading of Genesis 3, where I came to see the serpent, sometimes seen as the force of the opponent, the adversary, the satanic, a term that comes directly out of biblical Hebrew, along with several others. A term that, in fact, I grew up as a kid in a traditional Jewish background, hearing uttered in synagogue in a way that was morally neutral, not possessed of all the condemnatory weight that had been added to that term in later biblical antiquity and in immediate post-biblical antiquity and late antiquity. And I came to feel that that source, called the serpent, came as an emancipator, a usurper, a figure that actually told the first couple the truth, that they were being kept almost as fish in an aquarium, told that they can have all their needs fulfilled except one, eating from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, without which humanity is not really humanity. We're kind of kept beings in a paradisical cage, so to speak. And the cost of the first couple imbibing the so-called forbidden fruit was friction. Friction followed them into the world and followed into their lives. But friction seems to me to be the price of creativity. Without friction, there's no pathos.
Right.
Without friction, there's no expression. There's no creativity. Humanity wouldn't be itself. So I began to see how this usurping force had been transformed into something that seemed maleficent and scary and negative, and was reclaimed for a time actually by the Romantic poets, Percy Bysshe Shelley, Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley, William Blake, others. I suppose you could see John Milton as a pre-Romantic, Lord Byron, maybe most especially. And they saw the satanic as this force of revolution on an intimate scale, usurpation, creativity, radical selfhood, protean remaking of the self. Lord Byron explores these themes very arrestingly in a short play that he wrote called Cain, which is a perspective on the conflict between Cain and Abel from the viewpoint of Cain himself, who in Lord Byron's hands had his own point of view. It was so radical, so dramatic, to imagine that someone in the early Enlightenment age would say, what would this story look like if it was told from the point of view of the reputed bad guy? He has his perspective too. And it was so enlivening to me, and I thought, this is part of what I was grappling to express when I began to make this different reading of early scriptural and some earlier, I suppose you could say, primeval source literature. And I was so aroused and excited by what the Romantics had found, and I was driven to ask radical questions and to attempt a radical experiment, the results of which are still unfolding. You can check in with me, see how it's going. But it's been a hugely satisfying part of my path.
Well, yeah, and I think that the really valuable piece to take away from that is that we should be careful about getting married to any one way to interpret a symbol.
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of this underpinning in our culture, right? Is that we're so married to certain ideas. Getting back to what you were saying earlier, it's kind of funny. I was grilling my dad last night on the phone. My mom, in the 70s, she was practicing witchcraft, and she had an encyclopedia of demonology. But she didn't talk to any of us about it. I just knew she was up to this stuff. And I was like, man, she died, sadly, a long time ago, so in 1990. But man, I would love to have a conversation with her about what was going on in her head. I suspect, though, that it was hinged more in that the Catholic version of Satanism. She painted this really beautiful portrait of Lucifer.
Oh, wow.
In flames, like his face was fire. It was really cool. And I was asking Dad last night if he knew where that was. But anyway, this idea that it's okay to pursue your own dreams, that you don't have to have this sort of martyrdom, sacrifice yourself for others idea.
And it's often, if I may, it's a pretend martyrdom. You know, so few people ever put any skin in the game apropos of what they call themselves. And I've personally found, and look, this is just Mitch speaking, seeker to seeker. I'll leave it to your listeners to decide on their own takeaway. But the people with the prettiest language on the spiritual path are the first ones to stick a shiv in your ribs the moment you look the other way. That's been my personal experience.
Mine too.
And I say it with decades behind me. So I think that we're very good at being the heroes of our own little stories and talking about service and truth and understanding and so forth, but not showing up to help our friend move when we promise to, or things a hell of a lot more serious than that, or directing subtle insults at a longtime friend or relative or something. So pretty language is usually a big red flag to me because those are the stories we tell about ourselves, not that are told about us.
So what you're saying is that we're all full of shit.
Well, I think we have to work very hard not to be because we like to be held in esteem and we deliver the messages to other people that make us candidates for esteem, even if they have nothing to do with our actions. The Talmud says, beware the man who bespeaks his own virtue. You probably find some version of that in every culture all around the world. It's probably a pretty good principle.
Yes, definitely. One of the other pieces I wanted to bring up before we sign off is your essay on skepticism was really refreshing and heartening because one of the things I've come to conclude about the role skepticism seems to be playing more and more is that it's become really dogmatic.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm all for healthy skepticism. Like, I think we should all have a real healthy dose of it in our lives. But it makes me wonder, as the world is changing, and maybe our psyches are collectively changing, fingers crossed, that there's a swath of society that's kind of holding on to materialism as the end all with white knuckles.
Yeah. Well, there's a terrible intellectual impoverishment today in the professional skeptic apparatus, and there has been for a long time, because, the spiritual philosopher G.A. Gurdjieff made the observation that everything becomes its opposite. Every human device winds up becoming its opposite. So those who would liberate us from the cages wind up creating still stronger cages. And that's what's happened with the professional skeptics. Skepticism, to put it colloquially, is really supposed to be agnosticism, a suspension of belief, a questioning, not a rejectionism as a thought system in and of itself. And most of the skeptics who function today in public are very emotionally driven. They're very sentimental. They're self-certain to the point of anti-intellectualism. They assert things that they don't know, they haven't researched, they haven't looked at. There's no quality whatsoever of questioning or agnosticism. And if anything, there's a very great, frequently sarcastic, rhetorically driven triumphalism. And they're using all the formula of belief, of orthodox belief, as a way of defending rationalism, which is an irony that I can barely get my mind around some days. And I'm not sure I understand fully what drives them. I could attempt as good an armchair analysis as just about anybody. Fear, wanting to hang on to the old paradigms, becoming so invested in a point of view that reconsidering that point of view makes you feel almost unmoored from your sense of self, you name it. But the almost single-minded emotional quality that colors their rejectionism whilst they hang on to this noble title of skeptic presents a kind of barrier to debate, barrier to exchange that leaves me with very few people in that world to debate with. I care very deeply, for example, about academic ESP research. I'm a really big advocate of that work. I write about it in detail. I care about it. Obviously, I'm sympathetic towards it. There are holes in it. There are problems. Show them to me. Where have I gone wrong? Where are there mistakes? And most of these guys are incapable of doing that because they're so emotionally and dismissive of the whole enterprise itself that they're sloppy, they're lazy, they're very comfortable staying within the communities that present them with cultural affinities. So it would be as if I decided the only audience I'm ever going to write for, the only audience I'm ever going to speak to are people who agree with me, and be that large, be that small. Now, they have the bad fortune intellectually of there being a lot of people who agree with them. And it's bad fortune because there's always a place to go if you want to be lazy. There's always a place to go, and they'll take you in. And that does not do much to fortify the intellect. So we have a professional skeptic apparatus today that's in crisis, and that is bad for all of us. And I want there to be good, solid, earnest, searching skeptics.
Yeah, and good, solid research in these anomalous areas. Have you ever heard of the book Extraordinary Knowing?
Yes, I read that book many years ago. Author died shortly after it was published. But yeah, I did read that book.
I was teaching science and spirituality at the community college here in Vermont some years ago. I was having a hell of a time finding a good textbook, and that was the one I ended up finding. But that's another one of those books that kind of gives you inspiration.
Yeah, and her loss, the author's loss, was really tragic because she was a great communicator. And if not for her untimely death, I think she would have been a very important voice in this debate.
As well as yours.
Thank you.
So, Mitch, thank you so much for coming on and chatting with me.
Pleasure.
Always enjoy it.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Well, I hope you didn't get podcast whiplash. We touched on a lot of stuff. I really enjoyed talking with Mitch, especially because he likes hanging out in those uncertain places. You can find all things Mitch on his website, mitchhorowitz.com. You'll find a link in the show notes, along with links to check out the Magical Path Shamanic Workbook. All right, that does it for this episode. Thank you for listening. Have an incredible day. Until next time.